I'm David Petersen, and I want to talk with you guys about something that I constantly think about called world building. When you create a story, or even a single illustration that evokes a story, there is some amount of world building involved. Where are we? How does this society function? What are the cultural norms? Is there a history here? Or is there even a future here? From clothing to housing, how food is obtained and prepared, who is in charge, who is an outcast, what has no worth and what has value. Everything in your story and how it functions has the potential to build out your world. This subject touches on the concepts of tone and genre, mood and setting, but it's more than any of those, and it can be a rabbit hole of detail to tumble into. But it can also be managed, and if done with the audience in mind and the story that it's servicing, it's one of the most valuable tools you have as a storyteller. For the last 14 years, I've been building up a world of my own in the pages of the three main books of the Mouse Guard series, as well as in the Legends of the Guard spin-off volumes. Mouse Guard is a medieval fantasy comic with an altruistic group of mice called the Guard, and while it exists in a natural setting with real flora and fauna, I needed to world build to establish how mouse society functions and the larger world that it sits in. And I was world building this place long before 2005 when Mouse Guard was first published as a comic series, going all the way back to 1996 when I first came up with the idea of the Guard. It had grown out of a failed, massive world building exercise to create a talking animal fantasy story with each species having its own Tolkien-esque unique culture complete with languages, traditions, architecture, and lore for every species. If you want to know more about that, I'm posting a link in the chat now to a blog post where you can see more of those images, but I would ask that maybe you just bookmark that link and look at it after the lecture. But Mouse Guard came out of that failed world building exercise as a salvageable part in that mess of world building. Not something that would just overpower the failed version of it. The overwhelming mess was not just something that would overpower me as a writer and storyteller, but something that I worried would be too much for an audience to swallow easily without it taking several volumes that read more like encyclopedias to introduce everything. Since then, I've been able to not only explore Mouse Guard through the pages of my comics, but also through helping to create a role-playing game for the series. I think some of my best lessons in storytelling and world building came through playing tons of tabletop RPGs as a kid and as a teen. Sitting around a table in someone's basement or attic, collectively telling a story we were all visualizing in our heads at the same time. A magic trick where we were all living in a world that isn't there. Seeing this place and its characters in our mind, and collectively world building, doing a storytelling improv. But now that I've gotten my readers familiar with my work in Mouse Guard, for my next volume of Mouse Guard, I'll be exploring a whole new society of species in the Weasel War of 1149. I'd already established their architecture in past volumes, where the mice wander in their abandoned dwellings, in the dark and partly in ruin. Partly in ruin. But now I have to draw the weasel's world with the lights on. And full of not just weasels in general, but subspecies like stoats, mink, ermine, and ferrets, and implies subtle differences within their societies with dress, language, and cultural norms. It's the largest scale Mouse Guard story I've ever worked on, and something that scared me a bit, as overwhelming as that pre-Mouse Guard project I mentioned before. And I find that plowing through some of that fear and nailing down some things immediately can help. For instance, to help me visualize and design the complicated architecture and tile patterns from multiple angles, I have been literally building my world out of wood, cardboard, chipboard, paper, and glue. And those models help me create new story moments and answer world building questions I didn't know I had. But world building isn't all done at once. It's slowly established, layer by layer over time, the same way that you want to reveal it to an audience. Walking, talking mice is a silly concept, and it's easy for it to be dismissed or not able to support the weight of the stories I wanted to tell with them. So I've spent a great deal of time thinking about world building for MouseGuard, how to root my stories in a place that feel like the world is genuine and earnest and real in a way that you, the reader, suspend your disbelief and get invested in this place. Tonight I'm going to go over 3 of the ways I think about and develop my MouseGuard world to show who they are, what they believe in, and how they function as a society. Costumes and characters. Who are the main characters and the background characters in your story or your imagery? And what do their roles, their occupations, their jobs, and their quirks tell you about this world? And how is that conveyed to the audience? The guard mice in MouseGuard are like Tolkien's rangers. They are not armored soldiers. They travel light with minimal gear and their signature colored cloaks, spending more time out of doors than within. These 3 mice were the first 3 I ever came up with for my story. Not the 3 drawings of them, though. I showed those earlier. These 3 represent the main tenets of MouseGuard: attack, wisdom, and defense. All 3 have some amount of wrapped bindings to imply the wear and tear of their work, but I made sure each had unique details to tell about who they are and how they fit into the world. Saxon, whose name means sword, has a nicked ear, various cuts and scratches on his body, wields a sword, and his cloak is the color of aggression. Kenzie, in the middle, has a name that means wise. He has no sword, but rather a staff, something that can be replaced almost anywhere in their travels, off the ground or from a tree. His fur color implies age beyond his years, and his cloak colors and drape suggest a calmness and a regality. Rand, whose name means shield bearer, there on the right, has a cloak the color of caution, a belt that is woven and interlocked, a metaphor for the defensive nature of his weapon and his personality. But in MouseGuard, the female roles are as important in their society as the male ones. Sadie, on the left, is also a guard mouse. She is on equal footing as any of her male counterparts. There is no implication that it is unusual in any way to be a female in the organization. There is no gender prejudice against her, and in fact, she is the mouse who, when we first meet her, doesn't patrol in a group, but is seasoned and skilled enough to work alone. I made no point of this in the story. It was just depicted as is. The leader of the MouseGuard is always a woman, with the capital M title of matriarch. It was inspired by the role my grandmother played in our family as a leader, but an unsuspecting one. It took years of being an adult before I understood how much she was at the helm. And I was impressed by leadership that in no way had toxic masculine trappings of overt power or authority. And M on the right is an archivist and a historian, an educated position, showing again, without making a point of it, that gender bias doesn't really exist in MouseGuard society. Sure, I sometimes depict the mice in traditional gender roles, but Sadie and Gwendolyn and M are examples that also let my audience know that it doesn't mean it always must be so, or that the opposite is a taboo. I also try to be subtle with my visual cues for how to imply gender, without insulting or predictable and cliche trappings of dresses and eyelashes or physiques that refer to human bodies. And since I don't do a lot beyond fur color with altering the body shape or appearance of my mice, costuming is a very accessible way I can world build and inform my audience not just about the character, but about how they fit into the world. Different walks of life, different injuries, perhaps sustained in their trade, perhaps just a part of mouse life, can be quickly conveyed through costume to establish even these background characters. The details and intricacy of their garments can tell you about where they are in society, if they are affluent or poor, if they come from hardship or privilege, as well as maybe some specifics about their occupations. Sometimes those occupations need to be explored in a story or as single illustrations so that you as the world builder knows how they function in your world. Like this cook, and the different types of ingredients and the scale to a mouse, as well as the clothing and tools needed to prepare meals and feasts. Common trades like blacksmiths need to be established in my book, so working out what that worker looks like in your world, what their tools are, and if that varies from real world or historical record. Here I based a prominent blacksmith on Israel Skelton, the craftsman who made the mouse guard replica weapon merchandise at mouse scale for us. Even something as straightforward of a job as a baker comes up, even if something as straightforward as a job as a baker comes up, you need to be ready for that position in society, for what position in society that role has. If it's prestigious or working class. Both kind of bakers exist. What does your world need? To do the research for primitive baking techniques, I watched a UK TV series called Victorian Bakers, where modern-day bakers had to go to a working Victoria-era kitchen and use only what was available then. While my story is meant to evoke a medieval age, the research work of watching that show got me going in the right direction. And for MouseGuard, my mice invent things, and they improve their world with their own paws. They look to the night sky and chart the movement of stars. They build toys and puppets to bring joy to their fellows. My mice don't live in tree hollows and hidey holes. They value the locations they live in enough to design and plan them, not just for defense and practicality, but also as works of art. They are apothecaries who may be dealing with untested sciences of nature to heal the sick or mend the infirm. That chart on the wall is based on a real medieval drawing that was used as a guide for what the color of urine is supposed to diagnose in the patient. My mice need to map the world around them, to explore, and also to stay in the safety of their own territories. They spin fibers and weave their own cloth, and they make the practical, all manner of bottle and vessel for holding fluids. And they deal with the hard work and dangers involved with harvesting and transporting food. Figuring out how all of this works at mouse scale, what objects and tools related to their jobs do the mice handcraft, and what are found objects like plants, acorn caps, or pebbles. Do they modify these to suit their needs? And what do I base on real medieval craft and technology? And what to fake or make up is part of my world building. And I do a mix of thinking about what could functionally work, what I've researched or seen at historic living villages, and what I just make up because it simply looks cool, even if it doesn't practically make sense. What these occupations are not only create characters for the world and allow me to think about how the mice would do those jobs, or what visual differences I can play with to establish them, but the mere inclusion or exclusion of any of those walks of life will tell the audience something about the world. What jobs are needed and possible for survival in your world, and what occupations are a luxury beyond survival, an elective leisure that enriches that world's culture. The way your characters value the importance of any or all of these stations is world building. Part of my tagline with MouseGuard is that in spite of their plight, the mice not only survive, but thrive. My mice value the arts and intellectual pursuits, even though their mere survival is constantly at stake. To explain the prominence of books in MouseGuard, but also to show the importance of things beyond base level needs, I made sure there was a printmaking culture. I have my degree in printmaking, so the mouse patron saint, so to speak, is named after my beloved college printmaking professor, who in many ways put me on the path of illustration that I'm on now. And in establishing the importance of architecture and craftsmanship of the mice, I created a guild for the 4 building disciplines of mathematics, carpentry, stonemasonry, and metalwork. These 4 are the founders, or most revered for their techniques. The very inclusion of them specifically not only emphasized to my audience who Mouse Society is and what it values, but also has generated for me story ideas and places to go and time periods to explore within my world. The second world building area I'd like to talk about is culture and history. How a society records its history is as important as the history itself when world building. Oral traditions, written prose or poems, or something that implies certain value to the culture can be given a visualization and artistic permanence. For the record of the legend of the mouse hero, the Black Axe, I decided to create sections of illuminated manuscript. Obviously, I was inspired by the most famous real-world example, the Book of Kells. But that connection to what is a familiar historic item in our world adds intrinsic value to what I'm trying to communicate about the reverence and history associated with this part of my world. The time it takes for this world's inhabitants to craft the records of their history also implies things about their culture. When revisiting the lore of the Black Axe for the second time in the 3rd volume of the Mouse Guard series, I wanted to show more than one historic document of the legend. I turned to the real-life inspiration of the Bayeux tapestry, and I think the reader can infer the commitment of the mice involved to hand-paint intricate illuminations on parchment or embroider elaborate narratives with thread on cloth. The history these objects tell goes beyond the stories themselves, but in the cultures that recorded them and how much they value those stories. And to keep things visually interesting, I also like to depict mouse culture as recording parts of their history and lore in stained glass. This is one of the heads, the matriarchs of the Mouse Guard, but I'll talk more about them honored in stained glass a bit later. Not every bit of mouse lore or character is given this treatment. Elevating the important parts of your world by showing how they are remembered and cherished by your characters and cultures goes a long way to building your world. And what isn't given this level of respect, or where the record has been destroyed, or hidden away, or encoded. It is possible that your characters and their overall culture and society value very different things, where perhaps the most important lore and history to your characters has been outlawed. But what the society or powers that be have erected monuments is counter to the beliefs of your characters. As a method of culture, of communication, and oral tradition, I wanted my mice to be storytellers beyond the printed page. They put on performances of marionette puppet shows. This is from a Mouse Guard short story called Baldwin the Brave, and it's not just an excuse to draw puppets, but to explore what type of story and moral message the mice feel it's worth spreading. And what methods they use to show those stories. Here, it's a tale about bravery and the importance of action when evil comes around, rather than hoping for fate or others to act in your place. Songs have played a part in my storytelling of Mouse Guard, and it's a great way to do some world building. Almost every song I've written, the lyrics mainly, but the melody in 2 instances, is bittersweet in theme. And while I don't know if that was a world building intention of mine, or it just happened that way and somehow reflects the overall tone I want Mouse Guard to have, I don't know. This is an example of a melody by jazz pianist named Cliff Monier and illustrations by Justin Gerard for a Legends of the Guard story. It's about a mouse couple unable to bear children that carve wooden kid mice who come to life when given handmade clothes. But when the parents eventually pass away, the wooden children remain forever young to watch over the graves, all with a jaunty nursery rhyme tune. If you like to hear it, there is a free MP3 performance of it on the mouseguard.net website in the download section. And whether your story needs actual tunes and sheet music, or if it's the simple act of abstracting and simplifying a theme into a poem or lyric or fairy tale with elegant simplicity, it adds to the way you build your world. What deeds, what emotions, what principles do your characters use of their history and culture to entertain and inform each other and the audience with. There's a song in the 4th chapter of my winter book called The Ballad of the Ivory Lass that I use to help narrate 2 separate sets of visuals, a romantic love story and a horrific moment of loss and bravery. This illustration is something I have done now years later, illustrating a moment in that song. A lass who bore the light of the town, her fur of ivory thread, how she danced is stuck in my crown, and back to this glen my boat led. This illustration showed me that I can now even explore the possibility of a real-life inspiration for that song. But I couldn't do all of that planning and world building at once. I first had to write and use the song for the purpose of storytelling, and then look back at it years later as a way to even further the world building of Mouseguard. To allow myself to explore the artistic techniques my characters use to illustrate, decorate, and record their world, I do a bookplate every year, trying out some type of old world craft. Woodblock print, stained glass, embroidery, mosaic, stone relief, engraving, painted wood carving, and gouache. Sometimes I do these for real. The mosaic, the relief print, the painting, and the wood carving are actual physical objects. Others, like the stained glass and embroidery, are digital trickery. And the etching and stone relief are drawn examples of those mediums. But giving myself practice in these gives me an arsenal to show how this mouse culture records their history, all while implying it already when I simply sell these bookplates at conventions. Maps are another staple of world building that literally explore the world you're creating, but also imply a relationship your characters and society have with that world. What symbology is used? Are there off-limits areas, warnings, coded symbols, location names that imply characteristics or fill the audience's heads with specific themes? I've done several maps of the mouse territories, depicting it over time as some cities have come and gone, borders have changed, and even the elegance and decoration of the maps is altered. In a few cases, I was able to use a new map to world build in a retroactive continuity to fix my errors of cities mentioned in the dialogue that were not on the map. Sometimes I'm able to justify the explanation that it's because they were formed after the current map was drawn or had fallen long before it. And the way my characters use their maps is equally important. The mice out on patrol have no way of using cell phone or GPS to report back to Lockhaven of their progress or delays. So a mouse at Lockhaven will use pawns and pebbles. Pawn for the patrol leader, colored pebbles for the other members of the party, to track and the expected pace and locations of the guard mice. Having my mice actively use their maps, instead of just looking or pointing or having them hung on the walls, is a way to world build in the use and importance of understanding the world around my characters. Ceremonial events like inductions, rites of passage, or training tests can be dressed up or down, visually or in story form, to help build a world. What events deserve some pomp and circumstance, and which don't, are equally important. For the top illustration, I always envisioned a mouse joining the guard and being given their cloak, equal parts knighting ceremony, coronation, and getting sorted at Hogwarts. And I did my best to combine those influences into my world. What other events are celebrated in your world? Are there holidays, birthdays, anniversaries of events, both wonderful and tragic? When padding out the world for the Mouseguard RPG, game designer Luke Crane asked me to create one holiday or festival per season the mice would celebrate. And I tried very hard not to make them all close to our human equivalent holidays, linking some of them to contests or feats, while others were about the events that naturally occur with that season or the changing of the season, like a feast. Of course, with the winter season celebration called Yule Frost, it was very hard not to get bound up in the trappings of Christmas. Though in Mouseguard, this occasion is more about remembering and honoring the dead and holding close the mice that remain. My mice play games. After all, they are trying to thrive, not just survive. So in downtime, at taverns or home, They play a game of skill and chance called Swords and Strongholds. I drew this game into a few mouse guard pages and then built myself a model of the board and pawns for reference. I had no idea how the game was played, only that I illustrated it with the pawns on the intersection points of the board's grid and that the players also used cards. The RPG game designer Luke Crane, mouse guard RPG game designer Luke Crane, and I then later sat down and came up with rules for this game, and we kickstarted it. It is in essence something between checkers and chess that promotes the three tenets of the Guard: swords, strongholds, and diplomacy. Though we nixed the last word to make the title less of a mouthful. And what tall tales the mice tell gives the audience something about their society as well. In the spin-off series Legends of the Guard, I made every cover a single image legend of its own, including a one-paragraph description of the tale inside. In this case, I made a tale to help explain an odd location on the maps that was worth being marked, but only had one little house when the story went there. Am I still live for you guys? Julia's having trouble getting a connection. Can someone in the chat just beep me a message saying that I'm still going? Yep, still going. Okay. Where were we? We were that the... I apologize. I made every single cover Oh, that's right. In this case, I made a tall tale to help explain an odd location on the maps that was worth being marked, but only had one little house when the story actually went there. This legend depicts an attempt to relocate that original town by Turtle, and suggests that the move didn't go as planned, so only one of the original buildings still remains in Caligaro. Or legends can cover stories that may have happened, even if they are unlikely. It's plausible that they could have. Here, a mouse silk hunter, with his pack of fireflies brought to light his way, enchanted a society of moths so thoroughly they crowned him as their potentate. Legends can also be impossible fantasies of mice who are lords and barons of the undersea. And lastly, the tales that tell not only about the society, but how society perceives the dead and what happens after life. Here, a trio of musicians at the fall ceremony of Morton Harvest play such a rollicking tune that they raise the spirits of the long past for one last dance. And the third and final area of world building I want to cover are locations and architecture. Where characters live, what those places are built from, who has access to them, and how the inhabitants interact with their environments can be a source of tremendous amounts of world building. Often I find young world builders focus a lot on their characters and their world's history and timeline, but they see the locations as just backgrounds, and it's not set pieces to explore and design. As I showed at the start of the slideshow, I literally build my set locations. Cardboard, paper, dowels, foil, glue, basswood. They are all easy materials to obtain and to work with, even if you don't have a makerspace with jigsaws, drill presses, laser cutters, or 3D printers. I wanted to ground my characters in a reality of locations that feel like they exist. I can use these models to help me make that world more believable. I find that I design 3D environments better when I'm working in 3D. Holding up pieces of cardboard to each other and checking the size ratios or the angles that they connect at makes my spaces more interesting than if I draw them from scratch. I'm more likely when building a model to add steps, balconies, soffits, moldings, and plinths, interesting geometry that I would have lost if I was just left to draw it on a blank sheet of paper. I can also use this model for its geometry and perspective by photographing it and then using it as a guide to draw from or further ink over on a lightbox. This way, no matter what camera angle I choose for an illustration or a panel, I have the reference without having to do all the vanishing points and perspective geometry work. Purposely, I build these models to be modular, so I can pull sections, walls, floors, and ceilings away for a view from inside the structure. This helps with my storytelling. There's a great photo of Steven Spielberg working on Raiders of the Lost Ark, getting in close with a viewfinder over a sandbox that's been populated with army toys and models of World War II structures and vehicles. He was framing the shots for the movie that way. He was seeing how to tell the story beat by exploring that diorama. He wasn't able to see what he wanted or what worked until he explored his options. I use these models the same way, exploring them as I pace out each panel, deciding when to use a bird's eye view or a close-up or how much floor or ceiling should show to keep the panel visually interesting, but also to tell the story. The model of the June Alley Inn Tavern had an extra purpose. Like the other models, it helped me design a space that was interesting. It provided perspective reference, and I was able to populate it with the Easter eggs, in the form of the paintings on the walls that represented the different Legends of the Guard covers. But when I built this model as the backdrop for Legends of the Guard, what I was really worried about was that between the short anthology stories guests like Jeremy Bastian, Mark Smiley, and Carl Kerschel illustrated, I was going to do tavern scenes with mouse storytellers. And I didn't know how to introduce 15 or so new mouse storytellers to the audience for the first time, with only a page or two before we'd shift back into a contributor story, and not have the reader get confused about which mouse was which. So where the mice sat became just as valuable to me as their character or costume. Now, in addition to those other visual cues, I could rely on a reader noting if a mouse was near the fireplace, or that's the mouse at the table alone in the corner, or that one's near the stairs or the door. Architecture can help with world building. What is of value in a society also? Remember I mentioned mouse guard matriarchs depicted in stained glass? Well, after visiting a church in Ireland where the baptistry windows depicted icon-heavy figures of religious saints, I wanted to show that level of reverence for the most influential mice to have ever led the guard in a room that only the current matriarch is supposed to access, a place of reflection and past documents and artifacts from her predecessors. Some of the characters that I depicted in stained glass, I pulled from past references in mouse guard stories I had already told. Some were made up on the fly, and some were plucked from Legends of the Guard stories by other contributors I liked so much, I wanted them to be part of my real historic canon. The result is that when it came time to draw panels of this location, the effort I put into the design and the model becomes a weighted character in the scene. The setting is doing not only all of the world building here, but also some of the heavy lifting in the storytelling and mood. And while the models are nice for reference and perspective and design, it's what you do with the location that does the world building. I could have rendered this model as a stone structure, abandoned and crumbling, covered in moss, haunted and spooky. I could have done it as a regal atrium, elegantly painted with murals or trim details. Instead, I made it more rustic, with a utilitarian feel, and filled it with details to illustrate the story that I needed to tell, about a mouse who no longer wanted to take life with a sword, but instead wished to arm himself with wisdom, and is inducted into the guild of archivists, scribes, and thinkers with the touch of a feather quill. The room is a repository for all manner of artifacts, mostly gleaned from past Mouse Guard and Legends of the Guard stories, and they are not pristinely kept or necessarily given a seat of honor, but the very fact that they have been accumulated here tells you that these items are valued by some mice in society. Some of my models are built after a first drawing has already been done, because I need to draw that place more times than I had planned, and I need it for the reference. Like for this gatehouse that is the entrance to the mouse version of a Valhalla or Elysian Fields type afterlife called Sayan. Some models are so primitive I didn't finish building them, and I relied on pasting together multiple photo angles of the same model to build the geometry. This model was to help solve a location and logistics problem of how to depict a vertically laid out city inside a tree's trunk. Most of the details and design work for this location had to be done on the page. This location of Spruce Tuck, where I wanted the architecture to look like Brian Froud had designed the Ewok village, as an apartment building inside a hollow tree trunk. Locations are more than just backgrounds, though. They build your world and explain how it functions, what it values, and how the inhabitants live there. Whether it's a skull yurt on the threshold of the border to the wild country, or an idyllic and architectural wonder that depicts the afterlife. World building is accomplished by focusing on the norms and peculiarities of your characters, their professions and clothing, their histories and culture, and the places they live and inhabit. It's never done all at once. It's something that's easy to overdevelop too quickly and easy to overlook and rush through. But if you work at it, you can take your audience places that they understand completely and feel like residents of, even if those worlds never existed and are brand new to them.